Hello, welcome to the Technical Training Academy, brought to you by Mulveris Transmissions. I'm your host, Aaron Golis. Today we're going to be talking about thermal bypass valves, or TBV, as it's commonly abbreviated. If you're working on anything newer today, you've more than likely seen at some point a thermal bypass valve. You may or may not have known what it was, but we're going to go ahead and go over the ins and the outs of what it does and why we need it, when to potentially eliminate it, and some other modifications that are available to improve the transmission operation. Behind me, you're going to see several different components drawn on the board. In a little bit, we're going to get to the heat exchanger. For now, we're just going to focus strictly on the thermal bypass valve, which is essentially the transmission's version of a thermostat. Transmission fluid coming out of our feed port, hot, comes up to our thermal bypass valve. When the thermal bypass valve is warm, it expands and it seats on the housing, which forces the transmission fluid to take the path through the transmission cooler in the radiator and then return back to the transmission at a cooler temperature. However, when this is cool, when the transmission temperature is cool, this thermal pill is actually contracted and it raises off the seat because of the spring pressure. The cold fluid comes out of the transmission, comes up to our contracted thermal pill, and allows fluid to bypass the transmission cooler and return back to the transmission so that it will warm up the transmission fluid faster. There's another spring on here that's only there for dampening of any kind of excessive pressure in the system. Potentially, if the cooler gets plugged, that allows fluid to bypass that plugged cooler and return back to the transmission. That's only a short-term remedy to a bigger problem. Okay, so let's discuss where the thermal bypass valve may be located in a lot of these vehicles. Really falls into three different categories. You may have one in line, like this GM version here, or this Ford version that we have on the table, where the lines in and out are in between the radiator and the transmission. However, on some vehicles, particularly the Chrysler, the thermal bypass valve could be built into the transmission cooler, where the line bolts into it in the radiator. And basically what it does is it bypasses the fluid from going through the cooler, through the radiator, and it returns it straight back to the transmission through the lines. When it gets warm, it'll then open the passage so that it goes directly through the radiator and then returns cool fluid back through the lines. You may also have that built into the transmission itself, particularly on like your Ford vehicles, and a few others as well, but built into the valve body area. So you might have the thermal bypass in here that blocks off the fluid from actually coming out of the feed hole, and it'll actually just return it back to the pan and then circulate through the transmission. So in these systems, the fluid never actually even leaves the line. These are very difficult, and if you guys have ever tried to do a fluid exchange on a system like this, you know that is a very difficult process with a thermal bypass valve built internally to the transmission, because if the transmission's not up to temperature, you don't get any fluid coming out of there. It just circulates through the transmission internally. And then when you finally do get it up to temperature, you'll start circulating the cool transmission fluid, the new cool transmission fluid, back to the unit, which then cools off the thermal bypass, and then you'll repeat the cycle again. So even when you finally do get some flow out of it, it's very short-lived, and if you try to do that process, you'll be doing it for days. That's why a lot of those services they do with the transmission pan, they just do a drain and fill. They also have, just like we talked about in the 6L, the inline setup, they also sell a bypass kit for those as well that operates, turns it into full flow all the time. So cooler flow is continually going through the transmission cooler. But that is an aftermarket option. If you're purchasing one of our transmissions, obviously we are servicing this, so you don't have to worry about that piece. It's all built in. Okay, so those are thermal bypass valves. Let's talk about a fluid heat exchanger, which is different than, say, your transmission cooler that's built into, or your external cooler, which would be in front of your radiator. This is more like a radiator for the transmission, a dedicated heat exchanger for the transmission itself. What happens with a heat exchanger is our fluid continually circulates through that exchanger. We have coolant hoses that are connected to there that circulate coolant, engine coolant, around the outside of our heater coil. So as the engine warms up and brings up the heat, we are also bringing up the heat of our fluid exchanger, or heat exchanger anyhow. So this fluid is continually circulating and maintaining a temperature similar to the engine temperature. This is great for cold weather operation and warm up, and then allows the fluid, once it's up to temperature, to maintain that temperature back to the transmission. This setup works pretty well. There are multiple different combinations of this setup. This may be bolted directly to the transmission. Your Acuras, your Honda units are very famous for that, where the cooler bolts down on there. Several other units, they do that as well. This may be bolted directly to the engine itself. The 5.9 or the 6.7 diesel is one of the most common ones that comes to mind, where this is actually bolted directly to the engine itself, and the coolant is circulated through, maintaining that temperature. This may also be anywhere else in the cooler system. So it's important to read your service information to understand what you're working on. You may also have, and I've seen the coolant control valves that are built in line. That block off the engine coolant from circulating through the heat exchanger, further heating the transmission temperature. That block-off valve is controlled electronically through the engine's PCM to determine whether or not to allow the fluid to circulate and heat the transmission fluid up, or to cool it down. So why is this important? You want to keep in mind the transmission is producing a lot of heat, especially in the torque converter area. The more torque converter slip that you have, the more heat that's produced. The heat that's produced is inconsistent, can go up and go down. So the reason for these systems is to maintain the temperature, maintain the operating temperature of the transmission. Fluid viscosity is very dependent on the temperature that it operates at. So if we have a higher viscosity fluid that's operating in cooler climates, that fluid will operate much thicker than, say, a low viscosity fluid in the same conditions. So if you're driving a vehicle that's up in very cold climates all the time, say, below, in the negative temperatures, below zero regularly, it may not be a good idea to eliminate or bypass these temperature control devices, because you may find that the transmission doesn't operate very well, or it takes a very long time for it to operate correctly. You may find some hard shifts or other drivability symptoms, flares, things like that, because the fluid is not at optimal temperature. Again, if you're living in warm climates, eliminating these, you're probably not going to notice any downside, but you will definitely realize some upside in the fact that it's going to keep the transmission cooler, when you're putting it under a very heavy load or strain, prolonging the transmission life. Most common one that you're going to find is typically on your 6L 80 and 90 transmissions, and it looks a lot like this. If you're working on these transmissions, you have absolutely seen this. They are typically bolted to the side of the transmission. There's a gasket that goes here, and then this goes into the transmission itself, and then there is a through bolt that holds it down into the transmission, and then your line set, cooler line set, bolts into the other end. So this is in line from the transmission cooler ports to the transmission cooler. Here's another example, another one that's also in line. This is out of a Ford version. This would be for a 6F35 type transmission. Same thing, your lines actually go in on one side and out the other side. And essentially what you've got internally is a thermostat. Here's a cutaway of the thermal bypass valve itself. What it's doing is it's actually controlling the amount of fluid that is being delivered to the transmission cooler, just like an engine thermostat controls how much coolant goes to the radiator. The reason for this is to get the transmission to operate in temperature as quickly as possible, so that it will be thinner and more fuel efficient and work through the transmission more effectively. No matter which style thermal bypass valve you have, whether it's in the radiator, whether it's in line or in the transmission, they all work the same. They expand with heat closing off a passage. Here you can see the two sitting side by side, and they're at the same height. What we're going to do is we're going to take my custom tool, and we're going to dip this thing into a cup of boiling water, or what was boiling a few seconds ago. And this takes a little bit of time. They are a little bit slow to react. There we go. Just needed to add a little bit of heat. Now, if we set, well, burning that, those two side by side, you can see how much this thing actually expands when the fluid heats the thermal pill to the right temperature versus the cool one that's fully retracted. What forces the pill back down is spring pressure. So this spring sits up on top of here, like so. This spring sits below it, and I'm not going to pick that up because it's too hot. But the two springs together force that pill, when the temperature is cooled down enough, force that pill back to the fully retracted position. Once the pill is back in the fully retracted position, we are then heating the fluid up again and continually completing that cycle of open and close. These thermal pills can be designed to open at different temperatures. Just like an engine thermostat, if it opens at 180 degrees, that fluid temperature or that engine coolant, whichever one we're talking about, will continue to rise above the 180 degrees before it actually starts cooling it down. So if you have a thermal pill in the transmission, in the thermal bypass valve that is set for, say, 196 degrees, that transmission temperature will typically be over 200, somewhere in the 205 to 210 range. And then possibly higher if it's under a heavy load towing under high heat conditions, something like that. This is a big problem. GM actually had a TSB on lowering the temperature that thermal pill opens. They went from 196 down to 158 because they had a lot of issues with shift complaints, with torque converter shutter, and ultimately transmission failure. We're going to post a picture of the bottom of the thermal bypass valve of the updated version where it has a number 70 stamped on it. If you see the number 70, you know that you've got the updated version with the lower temperature in there. If you don't see that stamping, it's a great idea to replace it with the updated version just so you don't have premature failure of that transmission. Let's take a look at our cutaway of the thermal bypass valve. We've taken one of our housings and cut off a chunk so you guys can see inside of what the thermal bypass valve looks like. When you remove this from the transmission, what you'll find is a snap ring that holds this end cover in place. These are a little tricky to remove. You will want to first hit it with a little bit of penetrating oil if it looks like it's heavily corroded. And then what you want to do is you want to try and work the snap ring around. Give it a couple of whacks with a hammer, light taps, to try and get the ring to free up. What I like to do is put the whole housing in a vise, get our snap ring pliers in place, and try to get it to break free. A lot of times one side will and the other side won't. It'll be stuck in the groove. What you do is while you're holding the pliers, give your pliers a little tap with your hammer. Well, that'll actually break the snap ring outside of the groove and then free it up so that you can remove it. Once you have that done, if this is heavily corroded, it has not been removed in a while, it will be a little tricky to get out. What I like to do is take the whole thing over to my vise, and what I'm going to do is I'm going to tap on this flat, on the flat piece of my vise, give it a couple of really good whacks. But while you're doing that, you also want to kind of hold your finger just underneath the whole housing so that when you do this, you can keep this whole assembly from shooting out and scattering across your shop floor. So once that breaks free, like so, you're going to want to go ahead and take all the guts out of it. And as we've shown here, this spring sits down in the base of the housing, forcing this pill up when it's not expanded, when it's cool, forcing the pill up off of the seat right, as you can see right here. And that allows that fluid to bypass the transmission cooler and then return back to the transmission. On here, you're going to see we've got 2 O-rings. That allows the fluid to be separated in the chambers of the housing, and it only allows the fluid to go up through the center when the pill is unseated. It allows the fluid to bypass through here, and then through the grooves, and then back out to the transmission cooler. They do sell kits that you can replace the O-rings, the thermal pill. You can buy these parts in certain transmission kits. If you're replacing a transmission due to a complete meltdown, there's debris inside of the cooler and the lines and the thermal bypass valve, you want to make sure that you take this apart and clean this all out, because anytime that you don't, even if you replace the lines and the cooler, but you don't take care of this, any of the junk that was built up in there is now inside of this valve, and as soon as it reaches operating temperature, that will return back to your valve body and plug up the different ports, which is not good for a transmission. So we take our kit, we remove our O-rings, we want to make sure that we take our clip out. I'm not going to do this because I had to press this back in place. But if you take this clip out, there's a spring and a cap. This spring and that cap are held in by this retaining clip inside of our cap. So you want to take this clip out, and then these pieces will come out as well, and then go ahead and take everything over to the parts washer and clean it all up. If you don't have the updated version of this thermal bypass valve, then all of this stuff is not needed to do, because you should be replacing it with a new updated version anyhow. If you're dealing with our Ford version, or if you're dealing with one that's like a Chrysler or something of that nature that doesn't have any updates, you certainly want to take these pieces apart and clean them up and reseal them. So let's talk about a few other options that are available as well. If you are using this vehicle as a tow vehicle for a boat or camper or whatever, you're operating in warm climates, and this transmission is continually under a high load, high heat situation, you may not want to run the thermal bypass valve. You may want to elect to bypass that completely, bypass that system, so that it forces the transmission fluid through the cooler at all times. We recommend using brand new OE parts. However, these parts bypass kits are available, and we want to make sure that they're installed correctly. So we are not endorsed or sponsored by any of these companies in any way. We don't have any affiliation with them, and we're just going to point out some differences between the kits, as well as a couple of things that we do and don't like about them. So several of them here on the table. Some are from very well known and reputable companies. We have one from Transgo, we have another one from Superior. Then we have a couple here that are low cost options that you're going to find on the internet. Your favorite high volume online sellers make these available. So first off, we will start with the most basic of the 4 kits that I have here on the table. One that I actually like because it's very simplistic, it's very easy to work with. It's just basically it's just a blank that's machined out of aluminum. It's got a couple of O-rings on there, and it's very easy to install. Just remove all the guts that you have, everything from the housing. Make sure that the O-rings, even though they're new, make sure that the O-rings aren't nicked or deformed in any way that they may leak. Put a little bit of trans lube on there, Vaseline, whatever you got. You know, something that'll help this thing, you know, make it seat in the bore without rolling the ring or clipping the ring. And it's quite easy. You just go ahead and pop the new one in place. And then once it's fully seated, where you can see the ring groove all the way through, you know that it's fully seated. Then you can go ahead and pop your snap ring in place to retain the whole system in the housing. If you don't get your snap ring fully seated into the base of the ring groove, what could happen is when you do put this in service, it may unseat and blow the guts out on the road and leave you with a very high volume transmission leak, which we do not want. So make sure that the snap ring is in and fully seated. When you have it fully seated, you'll see that the ears are not touching or very close to each other. They'll be expanded, okay? If you can't seem to get it to seat, sometimes what you do is you take a hammer and a screwdriver and just kind of lightly tap it, and it'll actually seat it into the groove. If your ring groove is nice and clean, if you did your part on the cleaning side of things, then you probably won't have an issue with that. I like these because it's very simplistic. It's just a blank, and as you can see, it seals off this chamber, this lower chamber, from this upper chamber, forcing the fluid through this passage here, and keeping it blocked off from this passage. So it makes the fluid travel through the cooler and then back to the transmission. Next up, we have a kit from our friends over at Transgo. Very inclusive, comes with detailed instructions with part layout, all the pieces and parts that you're going to need, what to throw away, what to keep. Great instructions, great packaging. This kit will start off by, again, removing the snap ring. And then we're going to go ahead and pull out our end plug and then drop out the thermal pill and the spring. We are not going to be reusing these pieces. You're going to take apart this end plug here by removing this clip from here and then taking the spring out of the center. So what you'll have is this end cap, this spring, and this clip will come out of this end plug. I've already taken this one apart. We're going to use this for the demonstration. Those parts will not be reused. So all you're going to reuse from on the kit with the Transgo is the O-rings that are supplied in the kit. You're going to replace the O-rings on your end plug here with the ones supplied in the kit. You're going to add your O-ring to this blank, which I've already done. So you're going to have a new O-ring on the end cap and a new O-ring on this aluminum blank. Next, what you're going to do is you're going to take your pin that comes in the kit, insert it into the pin in your blank, and you're going to put these pieces all together like this. Then take this piece, your steel plug, and put it into your aluminum end plug so that it's like this. This is the easiest way that I've found to put this kit together. With these extra pieces, it is a little bit difficult to put together, but that's just how they designed the kit. Easy enough. If you hold it all like this, obviously I'm using a cutaway for demonstration purposes, but it works just the same. You work the top of the pill up in place, kind of just wiggle it a little bit, give it a push, and it's all set in place. So the biggest thing is to put the assembly together like that. If you do it the other way, the pin falls out, the blank doesn't get into position into the housing. This is the easiest way that I've found to do this kit. Then once you have that in place, you pop your snap ring back in place again. As I mentioned, make sure that the groove is fully seated, or all of these pieces will end up on the road with a giant transmission leak. And that's how you install that kit. Same principle as the first one. You are blocking off the fluid passage from here to here, from entering this fluid passage here and here. So you're just separating these two chambers, forcing, again, the transmission to travel through the transmission cooler and then back to the transmission, which keeps it much cooler than in the operation with the thermal bypass valve in operation. There is a picture of the part number in case you are looking to order the kit through Transco. Next up, we have a kit from our friends over at Superior. This kit is very detailed. It has all of the pieces and parts that you will need. Instructions, again, have all very detailed instructions, let you know what to replace and what to keep. The kit is very inclusive with all the parts that you will need to do this repair. Careful, you have a check ball in there. Again, we're starting off with the stock thermal bypass valve. We're going to remove our snap ring, and then we're going to go ahead and pop our end cap off. We're going to remove our thermal pill and spring. We are not going to reuse these pieces at all. This kit basically takes all of the guts out and replaces it with the parts from the kit. You get a couple of O-rings. We're going to put on our end plug. Okay. We're going to put a little light petroleum jelly or trans gel on there. We have our O-ring for our end plug here. And the way that this kit works is our check ball goes into our cap, and then our spring drops down on top of the check ball. It's important to note that this is a conical spring, and one end is narrower than the other. If you put the wide end down, the check ball will just sit inside of the spring and it's not going to do its job. If you put the narrow end down, then it's installed correctly. And then we are going to put our end plug in here. And as you see, this end plug keeps tension on that spring. Okay, so now what we're going to do is slide this entire assembly into, great, our GoPro is dead. We're going to slide this entire assembly into our housing. Again, gravity is our friend here. We're just going to go ahead and pop that in there, kind of give it a wiggle, a little bit of a wiggle there, and then just go ahead and push down. Of course, these O-rings are going to bind a little bit because I don't have any lube on there. So we're going to go ahead and put our end plug in here. You can see that this is fully seated with an O-ring, sealing off this chamber from this chamber. Now you might be asking yourself, why the other pieces in here? Well, this kit's a little bit different. The reason that they do this is in case you have a blockage in your transmission cooler, the pressure buildup in here will overcome that spring pressure that we showed you, that spring with the check ball, and it'll unseat the check ball and it'll allow that cooler flow to still circulate back to the transmission. It's not going through the cooler because it's plugged, but it is allowing the fluid to circulate back to the transmission, lubricate, and a little bit of coolant, not very much. Again, same as we talked about earlier with the springs in here, that does allow the fluid to circulate back, but it's a short-term solution to a bigger problem, being that the cooler is plugged. So that's how that kit works. Very simple. Once you have everything in place, again, put your snap ring in place so that you seal off the, so that you keep everything in place and don't blow the guts out on the road. I will say that this kit out of all of them is the pricier of the bunch. Do your homework. I'm sure that you can find these kits online or through your high volume suppliers to get your best rate. While this kit is the pricier of the bunch, there are alternatives out there. But again, this is kind of a buyer beware. I found this on our favorite high volume online seller for much cheaper, about half of what the Superior cost was. And at first glance, it all looks about the same. You have all the O-rings. You have all the same pieces. It all kind of looks the same. However, you can tell there's a difference in material. Not a huge deal. Looking at the different pieces, you can see the color difference, and you can actually feel the weight and everything is definitely different than the Superior kit. However, I don't think that's the problem with this kit. What I don't like is this spring right here. When we compare this spring in this kit to the one in the Superior kit, you can clearly see a difference in the spring tension. The color of the coil is different, so you can tell that the material is different in the spring. And then if I can get the spring out of the bag, when you put the two side by side, this isn't a very scientific way, but you can clearly feel the spring, the tension difference when you push on the two springs. The problem that I see with this kit, this knockoff kit, is that that spring is holding that check ball in the seat in this end plug, keeping this fluid to take the path through the cooler. If this spring doesn't hold this check ball on that seat, then essentially all you're doing is letting that fluid bypass the cooler and overheat the transmission. So yeah, this is about half the price, but you're doing it at the expense of the transmission, which in my book is not a good bet. I'm not going to go through the installation of this. It's the same on this kit as it was on the Superior kit. I just wanted to point out the difference in the materials so that you don't have to buy this kit and test it on your own. I've already shown you how it's constructed and what you're going to receive. It does have all the O-rings. I will say that these O-rings don't compare to what's in the Superior kit or the Transgo kit. These feel much softer rubber. I doubt, I don't have any experience, but I doubt that these will hold up to transmission fluid and temperature long term. So I do see that as a failure point. I don't have any experience with any of these kits in the vehicle, with the exception of this aluminum blank and this Transgo kit. Both of them worked flawlessly. They kept the transmission temperatures in check, and no overall performance issues.